Let's look at chapter 27 now. Keep moving on in Exodus to verse 1. The brazen altar that speaks of Christ's cross, which is the first object you bump into once you get inside the gate, is the tallest of all the pieces. You say, how do you know that? Well, it just takes a little bit of time. Remember, every number is there for a purpose. Look what it says in verse 1. You shall make an altar of acacia wood, 5 cubits long, 5 cubits wide. By the way, acacia wood is the wood the Egyptians used to build their boats. Did you know that? When they dig up these boats, these solar barges, or barks they call them, that are the boats the pharaohs were supposed to sail off into eternity in. Those are made of acacia wood. Because of the desert conditions, it made it a very fine-grained, hard wood. Very tight, very, very strong. But this 5 cubit by 5 cubit boat-building acacia wood, the altar shall be square, and its height shall be 3 cubits. So it's just about 5 feet high. That's the tallest object in the tabernacle. Isn't that fascinating? Why? Because what stands monumental? What did Paul catch out of this? God forbid that I should glory save in what? The cross. And the brazen altar is the beautiful picture of the cross, and where the sinner is dealt with. Their sin is placed on Christ. Fascinating, fascinating lesson. Well, we could go on. In fact, I don't want to, because I don't want to get off where I want to go, but just go a little bit further. Look at chapter 36 in verse 8. Let me just show you one more thing, because it says, then all the gifted artisans got going, and among them who worked in the tabernacle made 10 curtains of woven linen and blue and purple and scarlet thread with artistic designs, and cherubim they made them, and on it goes about all the lengths, and it describes all these sockets and all these boards and all these staves and all these different words. We don't even know some of them what they mean. All that to tell you that God said, I want you to write all this down and make this so I can meet with you. Now the question is, what's the big deal? How come Genesis 1:1, God takes one verse to explain the creation, or to declare the creation of the universe? Why does God go from that and go to 2 chapters to describe that creation process? And then why does he go on to give us 15 unbroken chapters about the articles and furniture of the tabernacle, and then an entire book, the book of Leviticus, with 27 chapters to describe what was supposed to go on in and around that tabernacle? Why would God speak more about the tabernacle than any other single topic in all the Bible? Well, to explain that, let me just briefly summarize. The tabernacle is God's photojournal that documents salvation. The tabernacle is not an afterthought. It is his premeditated explanation of what Jesus would do perfectly on the cross. Amazing to ponder that. The tabernacle is the clearest portrait of Christ and of his redemption that can be found in any part of the Old Testament. Even though God only uses 1 verse to record creation and 2 chapters to explain it, he takes 15 chapters only in the furniture and the accoutrements of the tabernacle. And then he goes on for another book to describe its actions. The task was so important that God did not depend on the ingenuity of the craftsmen. For a second, turn back to chapter 31. I want to show you of Exodus 31. Because God didn't send a little set of blueprints under Moses' arms and have Moses run down and find the most gifted contractors he could find. He did not do it that way. Look what God said. He said, this is so important. The Lord spoke to Moses, chapter 31:1, and said, see, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. And I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship to design. And he goes through the description of the tabernacle. Did you know it was so important? God said, you're not going to wing it. You're going to make it precisely after the model of the heavenly sanctuary that I have shown you. And you might have got the general idea that you wrote all this down, but he said, you cannot capture what I want, and so I am going to indwell and fill that man, and that artisan is going to have a spirit-filled giftedness in building the objects. which are my reflections of Christ's work. And so this work was so important, God didn't depend on the ingenuity of craftsmen following a blueprint. He actually came into them through His Spirit and guided every step of their work. Before God sent a person named Jesus Christ, He sent a picture called the Tabernacle. The Tabernacle is a photo album of the most detailed explanation of salvation in the Old Testament. The Tabernacle is the ABC book of Christian doctrine. It is a systematic theology that Paul actually uses in Romans to explain salvation. Paul could not fully explain the concept of the covering of Christ's blood without using the tabernacle. He said, that's the picture, and that's the only explanation I can come to. In fact, the writer of Hebrews had to use this to explain the fullness of Christ's great salvation. Well, in the Old Testament, the tabernacle is a dwelling place of God. In the New Testament, we, the church, become that dwelling place of God. But before the cross and before Christ came, God established ceremonies to typify, to shadow, and to explain Christ on the cross. That was His plan. The observant would clearly see that sin must be dealt with before God could be approached. In fact, that's what the whole tabernacle is about. You can't even come in without an offering. You can't come in unless sin is dealt with. You can't come in to that beautiful... Do you know what the Israelites saw? They saw a white wall. That's all they saw. These huge, high, pure white linen walls encircled that whole sacred compound, saying, God's holy, you're not, stay out. But if you want to come in, you came in God's way. Now, it's interesting for you that think through this, and we'll get to this in a few sessions, but what was rent at the cross? The veil, not the door. God says the way of salvation hasn't changed. The door to the tabernacle wasn't ripped. The way to worship hasn't been changed. Just the way into the presence of God, the veil, that is the flesh. That is to say, the flesh of Christ. Very interesting, because actually there were 3 separate doorways you went through to get to God. The big one on the outside that was 30 feet wide. Then you crossed the brazen altar and the laver. And then you got to the holy place, and there was a gate and a doorway and an entrance there. Then you got through that, and the high priest alone could go through the third one. Significant. And each of these speak, one of salvation and one of service, and finally the last one of intimacy and communion, which we won't go into tonight.